When a joiner in Derbyshire died in 2010, a house clearance firm almost threw his life's work into a skip. A neighbour stopped them just in time and pulled out a wooden tool chest. Inside were 31 hand tools. Every single one was made in Sheffield, and every single one was made before 1965. He still uses them today. He tried the modern versions of the same brands, and he returned them. The difference is not nostalgia, it is measurable. Blade hardness, sole flatness, the fit of a frog to a body casting. Numbers, tolerances, the kind of gap that a skilled person can feel through the handle of a tool before they have made a single cut. The old tools were made by people who understood that gap. The new ones were made by people who were never told it mattered. This is the story of how Britain dismantled the manufacturing culture that made those tools, who made that decision, and why the cost is still being paid. Sheffield sits in a river valley where the waters running off the eastern Pennines were fast enough to power grinding wheels before anyone thought of using coal to drive machinery. That accident of geography made it the edge tool capital of the world for nearly 600 years. By the middle of the 20th century, it was producing a significant share of the planet's high-quality hand tool blades, chisels that went to cabinet makers in New Zealand, plane blades that went to furniture workshops in Canada, saws that went to building sites across the British Empire and stayed in use for 50 years after the empire dissolved. The steel, the heat treatment, and the grinding were all local. What that cluster of proximity meant in practice was that a tool maker in Sheffield could walk down the street and talk to the metallurgist who had formulated the steel for his blades, and that metallurgist could talk to the grinder who had shaped them. And the grinder had opinions about what the steel was doing under the wheel, and that fed back into the next batch. It was a conversation that had been running for generations, not written down, not filed in a manual, carried by the people. We lost all of that. Then came a concept. It arrived in British boardrooms in the early 1980s, imported from American business schools, and made newly urgent by the deregulation of the City of London in 1986. The concept was that the purpose of a company is not to make things. It is to generate returns for the people who own shares in it. Everything else, the factory, the workers, the accumulated knowledge, the supply chain, the 70-year relationship between a tool maker and a steel forge is a cost to be managed. And costs, when they are managed properly, go down. The first thing to go was the people. Firms that had been making tools for over a century were absorbed into holding companies run by people who had never made anything. Workers were made redundant, and with them went the knowledge. Not written down, not documented, carried out of the factory in people's heads, and never brought back. Very little of it was written down in a form comprehensive enough to reconstitute what had been lost. The factories that survived that first wave faced a second pressure within a decade. The rise of the DIY superstore transformed British retail for hand tools in the 1990s. B&Q. Homebase. Stores that could put a tool in front of millions of consumers who had never set foot in a specialist ironmonger. The volumes were extraordinary. The margin requirements were crushing. To put a chisel on a shelf at a price point that moved by the pallet, you could not be paying Sheffield wages, Sheffield energy costs, and Sheffield steel prices. The maths were straightforward. One by one, the brands made the same decision. Move production overseas or disappear from the shelves entirely. The names stayed. The factories did not. The knowledge did not. In every case, the sequence was identical. Brand acquired by a financial buyer. Factory closed or rationalized. Production moved to cheaper labor. Quality was reduced to whatever level the new manufacturing environment would sustain. Brand name maintained as a licensing arrangement on a product with no connection to the object that had built the name's reputation over 2 centuries. The name survived. The thing the name stood for did not. Here is what that distinction costs a craftsman in practice. A handplane is a precision instrument. The sole must be flat to a tolerance measured in thousandths of an inch, or the tool will not cut true. The blade must be hardened to a specific range on the Rockwell scale, or it will either chip on contact with the wood or dull within minutes. The frog, the casting that holds the blade assembly, must fit the body without movement, or the adjustment will not hold. These are not aspirational standards. They are the minimum requirements for a tool that does what it claims to do. A plane made in Sheffield in 1955 met those standards because the people who made it would not pass it down the line if it did not. Not from idealism, from a culture of craft that embedded the standard in the people rather than in a quality control document. The document can be ignored. The culture cannot. When a senior worker on the factory floor had spent 30 years making planes and knew by hand what a correct frog fit felt like, the wrong frog fit did not leave his bench. That culture was not exported when the production moved offshore. It cannot be exported. It is not a specification. It is a disposition toward quality that forms through years of working alongside people who hold it. What was exported was the tooling, the drawings, and the brand name. What remained in Sheffield was the memory of what the tools used to be, distributed across the tool chests of working craftsmen and the benches of woodworkers who had inherited their fathers' and grandfathers' equipment and had no intention of replacing it. There is a man in Barnsley who repairs hand planes. He does not repair new ones. He does not repair them because the castings on new planes are frequently not worth the time investment. He repairs old ones, pre-1980. Stanleys, Records, and Prestons, the tools that came out of Sheffield when Sheffield still knew what it was doing. He is not a heritage project. He is a practical resource for people who need tools that work and have discovered, through experience rather than sentiment, that the tools that work are the ones made before the knowledge was lost. He has a waiting list of several months. The second-hand market for British hand tools made before 1980 is the rational economic response of skilled people to a collapsed manufacturing standard. A pre-1970 Marples chisel will take and hold a sharper edge than most new chisels at 3 times the equivalent price. Not because it is old, because it was made inside a supply chain that had spent 100 years learning how to make it correctly, and that supply chain no longer exists for anyone to draw on. You cannot rebuild it by simply returning the factory to Britain. The people who held the knowledge are gone. A new Sheffield toolmaker starting today would spend 20 years reconstructing what was erased, and at the end of those 20 years would be competing against manufacturers in China and Taiwan who have themselves spent 30 years building their own accumulated knowledge on the same designs. The window in which that knowledge could have been preserved was open for perhaps 15 years. The decision to close it was made by people who had no use for what was inside it. Britain stands today as a country where the names of its greatest manufacturing tradition are printed on the packaging of tools made overseas to tolerances that the original craftsmen would not have passed. The names remain because names can be owned, licensed, and monetized without a factory, without a metallurgist, without a grinding house, without a single person who knows what the steel is telling them when the color changes in the heat. The real tools are in the workshops, in the bottom drawers of garden sheds, on the shelves of estate sales in the towns where the factories used to be. Sheffield made them, and Sheffield has mostly forgotten it did. The Pennine waters still run fast enough to drive a grinding wheel. The knowledge of what to do with one is another matter entirely.